Hi, I'd like to thank the organising committee of the conference for inviting me to be one of the keynote speakers at this, the 14th Congress of the Latin American branch of IASPM. It's a great pleasure and honour to be here, even if here is currently in front of the camera in my home in London rather than in Medellin. And I apologise for presenting in English, as neither my Spanish nor my Portuguese is really strong enough to do otherwise. So, although, as my biography on the conference website points out, I've written in the past mostly about record production and recorded music, in this presentation I'm going to talk about a new monograph I'm writing on practical musicology for Bloomsbury Press and how it relates to a project I've been working on in Cuba led by Sarah McGuinness in conjunction with Sonia Perez Casola, Yaniela Morales and El Almacén Collective from Matanzas in Cuba. Sarah and Sonia are giving a paper presentation on other aspects of the project, so you can get some more details from looking at that. The first recording that we did involved Cuban rumba musicians from the Muñequitos de Matanzas, recorded in the Salar, or the tenement courtyard, where the group started over 60 years ago. And the basic idea is to create a room with 4 video walls, and each wall has some members of an ensemble projected onto it as if you're standing inside the ensemble. In addition, the sound of each of those members of the ensemble is only coming from the speakers behind that wall. So if you move towards the singer becomes louder as you approach their speaker, and likewise if you approach the congas, the same thing. Here's a short video where I'm walking outside the video walls of the room, filming inwards towards the audience inside. Before we talk any more about the Cuba project, I should introduce some of the ideas I'll be examining. I'm currently working on the development of a research network on 21st century music practice, which also involves some new publishing ventures. Firstly, there's the website, which hosts video presentations of practice research, and you can take a look using this URL. Secondly, there is the Cambridge University Press Elements series, which publish short 20 to 30,000 word monographs online, although they can be printed on demand as well, and which also on the online publication includes multimedia content. And then thirdly, there's a Bloomsbury Academic Press series on 21st century music practice, of which my book Practical Musicology will be the first monograph. But what then do I mean by practical musicology? There are 3 main points of focus in the study of music: the text, the context, and the practices of music making. And by text, I mean the song, the performance, the recording, the idea of music as a thing, a product, the output of some activity. And by context, I mean the circumstances in which music comes into existence, and these may be physical, social, cultural, and political. And by practices, I mean the activities, musical, logistical, technological, and economic, through which music is made and shared. Of course, there's overlap between these categories, but they're a useful tool for thinking about the subject. And the study of musical practice in popular music studies is much less developed than the study of musical contexts and musical texts, which have received quite a lot of attention. In the past 3 decades, there's been a substantial growth in higher education courses focusing on practical education of how to do popular music, and this requires a parallel growth in practical musicology. But what is the nature of this kind of practical musicology? Do we need theory about how to do music that is different to and or separate from music theory, musicology, or ethnomusicology? As you might guess, I'm going to argue yes, as otherwise this would be a very short keynote presentation. And the main reason that I would argue that this is necessary is that we need to address and to embrace the various aspects of subjectivity that are inherent in judgments of value and quality, and not just to describe them, but also to analyze them. On the one hand, music theory currently has subjectivity and ideology baked into it. Here you can see a screenshot from Philip Ewell's 2019 Society of Music Theory plenary address on the whiteness of music theory and the racism inherent in Schenkerian analysis. It's a talk that took the notions of race, whiteness and diversity right to the heart of the academic classical music world and caused a lot of controversy and soul-searching. It's interesting that despite his talk, a lot of the response in the classical musical world has been to do the opposite of what he was suggesting. The response has mainly been to look for composers of colour to incorporate into the canon. What Ewell was saying was that it is music theory that is white, and what we need is theory that accommodates different types of music rather than music that fits into existing white theory. And what we find within courses that teach popular music practice is exactly this problematic approach, trying to analyze diverse musical styles within a theoretical framework that was developed mainly for European and North American art music. The subjective value system of Western art music is deeply embedded in music education. We can't remove subjectivity and ideology, but we can explore it as an explicit part of music theory. Ethnomusicology has mostly sought to deal with this issue by being descriptive about judgment, value and quality, by trying to describe the participants' value system. In a practical musicology, we need to be able to use it and not just describe it. And as I've suggested within popular music studies, we have yet to address a fundamental problem. And that fundamental problem is that within classical music performance and composition pedagogy, there is a relatively homogeneous value system, a widely accepted set of criteria by which we can judge performance and perhaps to a lesser degree to composition. Popular music doesn't have that kind of homogeneity. You can't judge a punk rock performance or composition using the same criteria as you would for reggaeton, K-pop or grime. And this is why practical popular music courses either suffer from students feeling and perhaps being judged by the wrong criteria, and or from the perception that they're being judged with lower standards. So my quest for a practical musicology is about creating a theoretical framework that brings the subjectivity of judgment, quality and value into the frame and allows music theory to move beyond what Ewell calls the white racial frame and other frames based on hegemony and power, such as gender, sexuality, class and other constructions of socio-economic and cultural difference. The ancient Greeks are credited with coming up with the notion that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, that quality is ascribed by viewers rather than inscribed in objects. More recently, rather than succumbing to this flattening of aesthetics, that anything is potentially as beautiful as anything else and therefore that nothing has any more intrinsic value than anything else, we have developed the notion of the cultural construction of aesthetics, and this requires a more nuanced way of treating our interpretation of quality. I've been recently writing about a tripartite system of musical interpretation developed out of Richard Middleton's writing, and although he wrote about it from a slightly different perspective, his aim was to incorporate elements such as groove into music analysis. I have expanded the idea out from interpretation as a listening activity to also include creative forms of activity. Thus I use the term engagement rather than interpretation. So the first of these is a direct form, a kind of engagement such as empathy or entrainment that is in some way automatic. Unlike other animals, we have a form of cross-modal cognitive mechanism by which sound that we hear is in some way converted into an entrained or synchronized movement in two different and distinct areas of the brain. There is some element that's inherent, that is an inherent connection, and some that's learned. We're not born being able to tap our feet or nod our head to the sound of a drum, but we're also not born being able to walk, and both of these things seem to be human rather than cultural. Whether there is hardwiring in the brain, though, which we develop both through which we develop both of these capacities, is not important to this argument, but there are ways in which we respond to musical sound which are intrinsic to the vast majority of humanity. And the second of these categories, these three categories, is what I'm calling schema, following Kant and Feldman and Lakoff and Johnson. Schema are learned patterns of activity that create more complex narratives that form than direct forms of engagement, but there seems to be a blurred boundary between these two types of mental activity. The patterns may be multimodal, involving connections between audio and visual perception, for example. I know that seeing someone slap something with their hand sounds different to seeing and hearing them stamp on something with their foot. Or to be multimodal in the sense that my activity doing something is connected to a particular sound. The pattern may also be complex sequences with optional forks, like a flow diagram or a script for someone in telesales. If they say this, then you do this. And these may be very basic, such as if the guitar player speeds up, then I have to follow them, or more complex, such as a vocal signal I've learned to respond to by changing the pattern that I play on my conga. One of the key identifiers of this schema-based interpretations or activities is that they are learned and therefore subconscious. I don't need to consciously think about what should I do now. Again, though, there's a blurry boundary that takes us into the third category, that of problem solving. I may have to consciously reconstruct a memory that isn't so firmly established, that is automatic. More importantly, though, the conscious process of problem solving involves making connections between features of different schema that are similar and then drawing conclusions about unrelated ones. It's the basis of both lateral thinking and metaphor. And Middleton's hypothesis was that classical musicology was focused on this third category of interpretation, that it was predicated on consciously finding structure in complex musical pieces that was either based on harmonic progression, similarity and variation, or on thematic similarity and variation, and that while audiences might be engaging with an emotional narrative from the second category, or be carried along by a process of entrainment from the first category, these types of engagement were not of interest to musicology. This, of course, is an example of how a subjective value system is embedded in a musical culture. Not only is the third category given a heightened status, but problem solving involving harmonic structure and theme and variation are prioritized within that culture instead of other forms of problem solving. So the idea is that we can use this tripartite model to identify, categorize and analyze various forms of subjectivity and the systems of judgment, quality and value that they embody. Cuban rumba involves an entirely different value system in this regard, and just as they might judge Mozart or Bach as being very unsophisticated rhythmically, a Schenkerian analysis of a rumba tune would suggest it was highly simplistic because harmonic variation is not one of the forms of engagement that is valued or used. And I'm using this tripartite system in conjunction with two dichotomies that relate back to ideas such as Marshall McLuhan's The Medium is the Message, and my own writing on sonic cartoons and representational systems. And the first of these, The Medium and the Message, is perhaps less snappily but more accurately characterized as the representational system and that which is represented. And of course, McLuhan famously problematized the distinction between these two things, as we can think of, for example, by trying to distinguish between the ideas and the language used in a conversation. Do those ideas exist other than through language? And if we use different words, are we expressing something different? They feel different, and it feels as if we should be able to represent the same thing in two different ways, but that comes down to our definition of what the thing is. If I play the same piece of music in two different ways, we have to address the question of whether it is still the same piece of music. And if it means something different to me in each of these two different forms, then that would suggest that it has become two different things, albeit similar things. By the same token, the distinction between technical and aesthetic quality also seems intuitive, and yet becomes problematic on closer inspection. Demonstrating technical skill seems less contentious than perhaps emotional expression, but control isn't always about clarity. It can also be about the effective representation of a lack of control. And similarly, controlling the level and shape of musical expression seems like a question of aesthetics, and yet is a very technical process. The aesthetic quality is not, of course, only about the choice of what is represented, the ideas or emotions, but also about the choice of metaphors that are used to represent them, and therefore also about the technical question of how effectively the mode of expression has been used. In some ways, we could distinguish between technical and aesthetic in terms of our second and third levels of musical engagement. That technical quality is about skill which has been internalized to the point where conscious thought is no longer needed, except perhaps in moments when things go wrong. And that aesthetic quality is about problem solving, about a consciously chosen metaphor and the extent to which it represents an idea or feeling. It could be argued that defining aesthetics in this way is playing to an existing Western art music ideology, but again, that's only true if the third category is valued above the second category. But we risk tying ourselves in knots if we question whether describing the appreciation of metaphor as is aesthetic, but the appreciation of technique as somehow not aesthetic. In addition, we could argue that the message is comprised of the first and the second forms of engagement, and the medium is the third, but that's a metaphorical representation of some aspect of that it is a metaphorical representation of some aspect of a schema. We then have to get involved in a discussion as to whether a schema can be an embodied representation of previous problem solving and should thus be considered part of the medium of representation. Suffice to say that this is a complicated problem, and it's not going to be solved by me in a single monograph. The idea is to start this process of embedding subjectivity, of judgment, quality and value, into a branch of musicology so that researchers into practice and teachers of practice can embed different and appropriate notions of quality and value into their knowledge, so that we can make informed estimations about technical or aesthetic excellence that are appropriate to the music culture we're examining. Back to the Cuban case study, elsewhere in the conference you can see Sarah McGuinness and Sonia Perez-Casola's paper on the educational benefits of this system and the ways in which it represents reality. I want to talk about how the project relates to my ideas about how a representational system helps to determine what can be represented and therefore what can be analysed, and therefore about how the design and or the choice of a representational system is an ideological process. I also want to talk about how a system like this can help with exploring these subjective notions of value and quality that are essential to a practical musicology. I talked a little earlier on about the multimodal nature of knowledge and cognition. What we see is not separate from what we hear, taste, touch, or smell. All of our senses, including the sensation of moving and doing something, affect each other, as can be seen from this video of what is known as the McGurk effect, where what you hear is determined by what you look at.
Concentrate first on the right of the screen. Now to the left of the screen. The illusion occurs because what you are seeing clashes with what you are hearing.
And multimodality in our representational systems also have an effect on what we see and hear. Watching and listening to music through video and recording is a more passive activity than going to a concert or a physical participation in a live event. The McGurk effect is a very basic example of a highly complex phenomenon, the way in which the context in which we experience something affects the way in which we perceive and interpret it. In the world of film studies, the notion of subject position, the way that an audience member defines themselves in relation to a narrative, is of course dependent on their own subjectivity. Women may identify and interpret different elements of a narrative in different ways than men, children differently to adults. Individuals will have differences as well, and so forth. But that subject position is also influenced and determined by the mediation process, by camera angles, close-ups, edits, audio mixing and staging. They're telling you what's important. These techniques all guide and restrict your perception in some way, and the two-dimensionality of the experience restricts your ability to alter it by moving around and changing your position or the direction of your gaze as you would in real life. The conventional virtual reality of headsets allows an individual to interact, but it restricts it from being a communal interaction. By putting on the headset, you enter the virtual world alone. The music room provides a halfway house, allowing the audience more control over what they see and hear than conventional video and audio, whilst also maintaining the potential for communal experience. You can see from this clip of the Cuban music room presentation at the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford that the way that people are pointing things out to each other and moving around the room to look at and listen to something different from a close-up perspective. This is something that people tend not to do either at 2D film presentations or at live events. Being able to alter your own subject position, even in this limited manner, provides audiences and researchers with an agency that they don't usually have in purely recorded events. So they can rewatch the same moment from multiple perspectives, discussing those perspectives with other audience members and researchers at the same time. Of course, the multiple views are only possible in a recorded medium, and the process of stimulated recall, whereby a participant is shown a fragment of the recording and asked questions about it, something, can you remember why you looked at the lead vocalist at that moment? This can be engaged in with more detail and more perspectives with this system. And this greater level of detail allows for a more nuanced exploration of the subjectivity about judgment, quality and value through the theoretical model of three modes of engagement. Another key feature of my model is a further three-way distinction between the notions of restriction, affordance and influence. Restriction and affordance relate to the possible actions or responses that an individual perceives as being available to them in any given moment. Influence is related to them in that it involves the way that other individuals may affect my perception of restriction and affordance, and the power that I perceive that other individual to have. Whether I'm influenced by someone relies on whether they have some kind of power over me, but also whether I'm convinced by their argument or their other actions that there is another possibility. When Sarah and I were in Havana, we went to see various rumba artists, and there was one dancer who was bringing elements of contemporary pop music, pop performance into his rumba style. He was referred to as Michael Jackson in a way that was both slightly derogatory and acknowledging the innovative nature of his style of dancing at the time. For most of the performance, the influence of tradition was very strong, and the affordances for creative expression, what types of variation were appropriate in the cultural group, was much more limited than for him. Although they lived and worked in the same cultural community, they perceived different affordances for a particular type of cultural and emotional journey, and they had different ideas about who could and should influence them in that regard. Another common pattern of musicality involves the discipline of everyone in an ensemble starting with a strict formalism, and then certain players remain steady and others have the affordance of letting go in some way or expressing themselves more openly in some way. And one of the interesting things about the rich data afforded by the music room format is the enhanced ability to focus on and follow particular instruments, and how their function in an ensemble affords more or less freedom. On the one hand, the music room representation system affords a clearer perception of these things, but we also need to consider how much it restricts the forms of communication and interaction that these players normally engage in. Normally the players would configure themselves in a much tighter grouping, and when playing in this more distance configuration, we had to use public address monitors, a PA system, so that they could hear each other clearly. On a more generalized level, we might consider restriction, affordance, and influence in relation to rumba and gender. In my limited experience, all female groups were more common than mixed groups. As a woman wanting to be involved in rumba, I might feel that certain tropes about appropriate feminine identity in relation to rumba inhibit my desire to become a percussionist rather than a dancer. Or the inhibitions that I see implicitly manifested in others, through their absence for example, might influence me to go ahead and do it anyway. And the patterns of restriction, affordance and influence might make it easier to sit outside of the male-dominated performance culture by setting up an all-female group. Identifying these patterns of restriction, affordance and influence is another aspect of theorizing subjectivity, this time through the perceived possibilities for action, or lack of them, rather than the types of interpretation and engagement with the music itself. The aspect of the theory I want to turn to is the idea of thinking as doing, particularly drawing on ideas from Tim Ingold and Alva Noe. Ingold, an anthropologist, is concerned with the notion of being shaped by our continual engagement with our environment. He uses the terms dwelling and wayfaring to emphasize that these activities shape the way we think about everything, as well as the specifics of how we live in those circumstances. And Noe approaches the issue from the angles of philosophy and neuroscience. He proposes that the feeling we perceive when a neuron fires must be the same whether it's to do with visual or oral perception or motor activity. The only difference between seeing, hearing, moving one's leg or any other neural activity is in the shape of the patterns of neural activity. That's what feels different. And the sensation of moving one's body are the same and intertwined with the sensations of sensory input. the pathways of behavior are either reinforced or by pleasure or suppressed by pain or stress. And the neurons which receive information from, for example, my eyes via the optic nerve are learning successful, responsive and reactive behavior by organizing that information in successful ways and by responding with similarly successful movement triggers. The way that I create the schema of our second category of engagement is through habitual and repeated use. I learn to see in the sense that my brain learned to distill the complicated, chaotic and constantly moving stimuli from my retina into schematic simplifications in the same way that I learned to walk by experimenting with the many complicated possibilities of balancing and moving until I had acquired various rules of thumb in the form of schema. Learning to be a musician in a particular style and culture involves developing these types of schema through repetition and reinforcement, comparing my own performance with examples I perceive to be good, but also developing strategies for conscious variation, repetition and combination. In order to theorize this, we need to be able to distinguish between these types of activities. I'm not suggesting that the music room format is the only way or even the major way that this can be done, but it does provide a potential mechanism whereby we can see and hear through this immersive media format which elements of activity have been schematized or automatic, both the second type of perception, interpretation and the second type of action, and which are involving conscious, specific communicative activity and therefore are of the third type. If you look at the conga players in this example, there's a moment of verbal communication between the three of them that leads to a quite dramatic change of performance activity. The final aspect of the theory that I'm going to look at today is the ways in which power relationships manifest themselves. The middle player in the last example seemed to be the person who was giving instructions. Players in different cultures and in different positions within those cultures will have different roles to play, and hierarchies of power are often complex, delineated or restricted to certain areas or under a process of negotiation and renegotiation. I might be the one in an ensemble who leads discussions about musical quality during rehearsal, but someone else directs performance and someone else deals with the finances. We might all have different ideas about how this translates into a more general hierarchy, and that might be guided by non-musical cultural norms such as age seniority, gender or class. In the Cuban music room examples, we can use the expanded access to visual cues to establish what are the hierarchies, but also who's making the decisions and can we see them being made and communicated in some way, either sonically or visually. And of course, by way of returning full circle to Philip Ewell, power relationships are inherent in all aspects of music making analysis, from the subjective judgments of musical participants to decisions about what and how music will be studied. Let's go back to that question of what is practical musicology. The idea is to use existing theory and to develop new theory to help musicians do music better. As is always useful with research questions, we should clarify some of the definitions used. On the one hand, as we've seen from Ewell's discussion, we need our definitions of music and musicians to be broad and inclusive. But what that shouldn't mean is that we're trying to fit them into an unsuitable and inflexible theoretical model. That's where the definition of doing it better is vital. The subjectivity that frames music theory needs to be part of the theoretical model itself. We need to be sure that judgments of quality and value are owned by the participants as well as by the analysts or researchers. We need to include mechanisms within the theory that account for this subjectivity in a rigorous, logical and evidence-based manner. We also need to develop more rigorous ways to study and analyze musical activity that also incorporate power, influence, and the physically, psychologically, and culturally constructed understanding of our thoughts and actions in any given moment. And this needs to be framed in a way that incorporates current research-informed knowledge about the way humans work in general. However, despite my efforts to include many case studies of practice in the book, none of them are substantial research projects which use this theoretical basis to conduct a meaningful study from start to finish. They're all past projects and examples into which I can retrofit some of the theory. Working on this Cuban project with Sarah, Sonia, Yaniela and the guys from LLMSN has happened in parallel with the development of the book and these ideas. If anything, the theory has evolved out of these research projects, including my classical music hyperproduction project and a fusion album of my own that I'm working on at the moment. The next step, once I've actually finished writing the book, is to test the theory more rigorously, to use the theory as a structuring principle in one or more research projects. So I want to finish by just imagining what that might look like. Like to explore this methodology through both my own practice as research and through studying the practice of others, such as the Muñequitos de Matanzas in this Cuban example. In both cases, the objective would be to triangulate between documentation of the practice and some kind of interview or journaling process. Nothing that's substantially different to autoethnographic or ethnographic studies as they're currently established. And of course, the interviewing or journaling process can quite easily be directed towards our various theoretical concepts: subjectivity, the judgment, quality and value, three forms of musical engagement, the importance of multimodality, restriction, affordance and influence as factors that shape musical activity, thinking as doing, about understanding theory as a distillation and representation of process. It's about how we do things, including thinking about what we're doing, and finally about power relationships. What's more difficult is thinking about how to document practice in ways that also bring these features out. Where are these evident, visible or audible in the process, and how can you capture them? Judgment processes are probably the most visible from the practitioner perspective in the developmental process. Their satisfaction or dissatisfaction manifests itself in activity, repeating something until it improves or is right. Capturing these changes allows a researcher to examine whether the practices of improvement are the same as those that the practitioner describes in interview or in their journal. And this, along with more general characteristics of the musical output, can also be used to explore how a practitioner engages with the direct, schematic and problem-solving modes. These are internal processes, but they have musical results in terms of simple or complex structures, the importance of groove or momentum, etc. While I talked earlier about multimodality mostly in terms of how an audience can engage with different types of mediated documentation, such as the music room format, there's also the question about how important it is at any given point in an ensemble performance for each participant to see and hear others in order to participate effectively. The Muñequitos de Matanzas example not only allowed us to look at each of the players in greater detail than a single video camera did, but by placing the players slightly further from each other than they normally would be, it meant that the moments where they were looking up or around became slightly more exaggerated. Trying to observe restriction, affordance and influence is problematic in some ways, as it's a term that relates to the participants' internal world. It's a psychological phenomenon, even when it's determined by their body or their environment. This then is an opportune moment for stimulated recall, in particular for the researcher to examine the documentation of their practice and to try to pinpoint moments when something significant was either done or not done, and to present this to the participant and to ask them about it. Similarly, thinking as doing is another internal process where a researcher can explore the data for outward signs in this stimulated recall For example, that looked like a moment where you made a mistake and nearly lost it, but it also gave you an idea. Is that true? And finally, power relationships. There's quite extensive existing work in some areas of musical activity about this. Directing, rehearsals and record production are two examples, but there's a lot of interesting work that can be done in this area. For example, in music that uses extensive electronic technology, what's the power relationship between the designer of the technology and the user of it? Both are influenced by each other in complex ways in a distributed and sense, both in time and in space. Of course, true to the philosophy of this project, I'm not asserting that my interpretation is right and that others are wrong, but I am putting forward what I trust is an evidence-based argument. Of course, just as I argue against the flattening of aesthetics earlier in this talk, I would also argue against the idea that any interpretation is as good as any other. We've seen enough of that in politics recently. I believe in what I'm writing about, or I wouldn't be writing about it. However, I also believe that our theories, particularly theories about society and culture, are tools rather than exhaustive analytical or descriptive models, and different tools are useful in different circumstances. Sometimes we need a hammer and sometimes we need a saw, and they're both equally useful in different ways in carpentry. But some other tools might not be particularly well designed. Anyway, thank you very much for listening. I would be very happy to answer any questions either in person on the now or afterwards via email at the email address shown.
Buenas tardes a todo el mundo. Muchas gracias por haberse conectado a esta conferencia magistral, la tercera de las conferencias magistrales que teníamos preparadas como parte del 14º Congreso de la Rama Latinoamericana de la Asociación Internacional para el Estudio de la Música Popular, IASPM. Esto debe haber sido presencial, sin embargo estamos aquí conectados de manera virtual. Aún así, pues agradecen las instituciones anfitrionas, Universidad de Antioquia, Universidad AFIT, ITM y la Débora Arango. Para esta tarde vamos a tener una ronda de preguntas entonces. Yo soy Jorge Valencia del ITM en Medellín y estoy acompañado de dos grandes amigos, colegas y personas que tienen mucho respeto e importancia y relevancia en todo el tema de la producción musical y la musicología. Hablo de mis amigos que ya se van a presentar y ya los vamos a darle una mejor bienvenida. Mi amigo Marco Antonio Juan de Dios Cuartas y mi amigo Simon Zargoski-Thomas. Bienvenido, Marco, ¿cómo estás?
Hola, bienvenido. Muchísimas gracias por la presentación. Bueno, bienvenidos a todos los asistentes a este 14 Congreso de IASPM América Latina. Efectivamente, para mí es bueno, todo un placer y, desde luego, agradezco a la organización del Congreso haberme dado esta oportunidad de formar parte de este maravilloso panel y de esta presentación, de esta conferencia que acabamos de escuchar ahora mismo y que seguro que va a suscitar muchísimas preguntas, dudas. Bueno, toda una declaración de intenciones y todo un manifiesto sobre este concepto que Simon acaba de presentarnos sobre lo que sería la musicología práctica. Paso a presentar a Simon. Simon, welcome. Simon Zargoski-Thomas is Professor of Music at the London College of Music, University of West London, and Director of the Art of Record Production Conference too. Welcome, Simon, and congratulations for your presentation.
Thank you. Yeah, I should say I'm the ex-director of the...
Sorry. Ex-director, sorry. I think it's necessary to systematize the analysis methodology, but in musicology analysis. But when establishing the difference between engagement, this concept of engagement and performance, interpretation, do you think that performance involves as compositional act? What's your opinion on the performance as an act in which the musical work is produced?
Actually, I was talking to a PhD student about this 2 days ago. Yeah, sorry, I'm I've got a bunged up nose at the moment, but I'm so my voice is slightly lower than normal. But yeah, I think normally the difference between improvisation and composition is kind of described as a continuum. I don't think that's really either right or useful in a lot of ways. I think that the difference is between something that is in the moment and something that is considered and therefore editable, and so the it depends. Your definition of composition may simply be of creating something new, in which case then both of them are composition. But if the definition relates to this process of reflection and editing, then obviously that can't happen in a process of performance, because apart from in recorded versions, you can't go back in time.
The popular music needs specific tools, sure. But when analyzing the text and the context, don't you think that ethnomusicology analysis tools can be used in the practical musicology you are referring to?
Yeah, I mentioned that as well. That the idea of using things that are used in ethnomusicology. I mean, the things like journaling and video. These are all things that can help us to understand it. But I think what I was trying to get across in the talk is that the primary difference is about this idea of subjectivity, of that within a practical musicology, you have to think about the use of the value system and engage with the use of the value system, whereas within ethnomusicology, it's more about trying to describe and perhaps analyze the value system, but not to consider its aesthetic use. So I think that's the primary difference. I mean, we're all trying to study practice, but what's difficult with ethnomusicology or using ethnographic studies of practice in terms of teaching or even just understanding creative practice, those aesthetics are not embedded in the process. And I think we just need, from this perspective, we need ways of being able to see multiple aesthetics and describe multiple aesthetics, but also think about how therefore they can be used and how I can how I can use those aesthetic judgments to therefore, if I've got aesthetic judgments, I can decide what's better and what's worse. Whereas in ethnomusicology, generally what's better and what's worse isn't part of the equation. It's what has happened is the question in ethnomusicology. They're not so concerned generally about was that a good take or a bad take. Whereas in practical musicology, that's the essence of it.
Okay. Thank you, Simon. Creo que tenemos preguntas, Jorge.
Por aquí tenemos una pregunta en el chat. Simon, we have a question from the audience.
Yep.
Santa Maria Caro is asking, she says that all these tools have been described from a very analytic point of view. And she asks, what do you think, or how would you think of these tools for the teaching of music?
I think the I think my practical teaching is mostly about record production and how to do record production, and the idea of understanding the theory of how producers work or how people make aesthetic decisions about a mix or a take in a recording is it's something that's very hard to teach unless you've got a theoretical basis for what constitutes good or bad, and I think that's true of all, of performance as well, and that developing these tools in order to let the students reflect on what quality is in their minds, not just in the world's minds. I mean, both of those things need to be considered, but they need to think about those questions of judgment, and the way that they can do that. Well, this is one of the ways I'm proposing as a way of doing that. I'm sure there are other ways as well, because there's lots of ways into musicological analysis, but that's the basis of it, is that, I mean, we're always using theory when we teach. A lot of the time we kind of hide it within the practical ways that we teach someone something, but we're still doing that on the basis of a theory. And I think the problem is that we're often not understanding the theory behind our aesthetic judgments, as well as we're understanding the theory behind our technical judgments.
Pues un poco como para sintetizar lo que acaba de decir Simon, para responder la pregunta, es que él habla dentro de su experiencia como profesor en la parte de producción, que es en lo que él enseña. Él menciona mucho que todo esto sirve porque todo estudiante y todo el mundo debe tener un juicio sobre lo que produce. Tiene que saber si es bueno, si es malo, y pues todas estas herramientas ayudan a dar ese valor. Él igual dice que muchas de las cosas que él imparte en clase, por dentro está mimetizado un poco toda la teoría que ha basado su aprendizaje en toda la vida. Entonces, que eso siempre va a estar de fondo, un poco de base dentro de lo que él enseña. Sin embargo, lo importante es que cada estudiante, cada uno también aprenda a tener sus propias herramientas, de tener sus juicios de valor sobre lo que es bueno y lo que es malo para él, y no solo para el mundo, sino también para él desde el punto de vista de las herramientas que él habla. And we have another question from the audience, Simon. Fernando Mora Angel. He says, hello, Simon. How do you see these tools as creative or compositional devices?
Yeah, I think this is very important as well. I've been again, I find that my creative practice has changed a lot through developing these theoretical ideas, thinking about the types of metaphors that I'm using and why I'm using them in a particular musical instance, for whatever it might be, have been, there is a problem with it in that it makes you more self-conscious about those decisions, but it's also, for me, a way of breaking through barriers where those kind of instinctive decisions that I am used to making in my musical practice lead me up to a brick wall or something, that when I get to a point where things aren't going right, then that's where the theory allows me to step back and go, well, what is the why is it that if I give an example from the hyper-production thing that I've been doing recently, I was trying to stage a recording of a Rameau piece of piano music, and and I was thinking about how to process the ornamentation. I'm trying to do something weird with it, and I was basically I needed to get something structurally coherent that would work, that people would recognize as a pattern in what I was doing, rather than just thinking, well, that sounds cool, I'll do that, let me do it again. If I could stop and say, that sounded cool, but what is the principle behind that? And I can then start to apply that principle in lots of different ways and explore it as a principle. And I think that's I think that in some ways it's behind ideas like Brian Eno's oblique strategies, where he sort of gets you to stop and think about what you're doing in a different way. I think those are kind of a bit quirky but interesting. But I think if you develop your own metaphors, creative metaphors, by using musical theory, then you can do really interesting things with that.
Bueno, también para sumarizar un poco y para que nos alcance el tiempo para las demás preguntas, pues Simon habla de que esto ha influido mucho también su propio trabajo creativo, que él trata de involucrar todas estas herramientas cuando él está creando. Hablaba de un caso particular en su último trabajo creativo en el cual, cuando trataba de hacer una cosa con el piano y lo quería procesar de una manera extrema y crear algo diferente, algo le gustaba cómo sonaba y él quería tratar de también de justificar esa metáfora que le estaba creando, no simplemente decir, esto sonó muy chévere, sigamos adelante, sino también como decir, en cómo justifico esto y cómo lo convierto en un patrón que yo pueda repetir posteriormente. Entonces él habla de que él está incorporando todo el tiempo este tipo de herramientas en su trabajo. Another question from the audience, from Carlos Andrés Caballero. He asks, how involved is the Cuban group with your with your research?
Well, they participated in the sense of being interviewed as well as performing for us, but I should clarify that it's not the whole of the Muñequitos group. It's several it's a bigger group than that normally, so it was just several of them who agreed to do it, but they're some of the core members. Their main involvement was on a single day. They came, they did the performance, we interviewed them, and Sonia in particular went round and talked to everyone one at a time, and Daniela as well. We're talking to them one at a time to get an idea of something about the background of the group, but also to some extent what they thought about recording as a process, because they're a very famous band that tours all over the world and has won Grammys. So they're experienced at all of these things. So trying to get a little bit from them about their how their perception of recorded and live sound related to that activity, which was this kind of slightly weird hybrid. Is that?
Bueno, él habla de que el grupo se ha involucrado desde el punto de vista que han estado disponibles, que se ha podido hablar con ellos y están disponibles para todas las entrevistas, y su punto de vista es muy importante porque es un grupo grande que hace tours, hace giras por todo el mundo. Entonces tener sus opiniones también sobre qué tal es la experiencia cuando se toca en vivo, cuando se graba, o este tipo de experiencias a las que ellos también fueron partícipes. Solamente saber su realimentación de cómo perciben ellos el proceso creativo que se desprende de estas actividades, desde ese punto de vista han tenido la fortuna pues de contar con ellos. We're going to have two last questions for today, Simon, if you agree, of course. And Juan Francisco Sanz, he's asking, according to the theory of let me first try to understand it in Spanish and then I'll try to translate it. So according to the theory of this acting of speech, the text itself, it's a practice, right? So text and act, it's what Taruskin calls it. Why should be differentiated the practice of the text and the context in your work?
Yeah, okay. I think the way I would discuss this is all of our theories about music are metaphors rather than literal. They're not the way things are. So there is no separation between a text and a context. There is no separation between a text and the activity that makes the text. And in fact, a lot of my work is about that interconnectedness in the same way that what we hear is activity rather than a thing. But with all of this, it's also about what is a useful way to create a discussion. By representing this in particular ways, I can understand the world in a particular way. So I think it's about whether I think it's a useful way to represent musical ideas, and I do. So I agree that these distinctions are artificial, but without artificial distinctions, the artificial distinctions are tools for thinking, and in that respect, they take us down a journey, and we can decide whether it's a good journey or a bad journey, in terms of how much it helps us to understand what we think we are experiencing.
Ok, pues él está de acuerdo inicialmente en que son cosas que no se deberían separar o que no están separadas por sí, por la naturaleza, sino que simplemente es una forma para ayudar a pensarlas y a entenderlas, que simplemente él no quiere antes separarlas, sino que a través de la descripción de ellas él quiere encontrar esos vínculos y cómo se unen, descubrir y describir cómo se unen y cuáles son los vínculos que unen ambas cosas. And we have the last question for today. Give me a second, I read it first. Marco, would you give me a hand here, maybe, if you can get the question better?
¿Cómo estos modos de habilitar? Wait. It's the question of Faber, Arley, Franco.
Yeah,
What?
that one.
Wait a moment. The chat? Okay, here.
So I've just Googled Translate just to see if it helped me.
Oh, did you?
And
did it help?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I'm not sure these are ways of inhabiting the world of sound and performance. Maybe they are. Yeah. But it seems in some way that the question's relating back to this idea of why is this kind of theoretical model useful to practitioners and to students learning about practice. I'm hoping that's what you mean, Faber. I'm going to answer that question anyway, and if it's the wrong question, then maybe you can email me afterwards. Yeah, go on.
The question is the connection between the sound wall and the interaction between sound and social interaction. I think the concept of the technology mediation is important in this case.
Right. Yeah. Well, okay. There's sort of two questions in there. One is hearing action in sound, or hearing activity in sound, is to me a kind of basic way of it's a way of creating a musicology that has a strong sense of meaning, that um, that when I hear a piece of music, I hear not only chords and musical language, I also hear a type of activity. So I hear either angry activity or happy activity, or and those things come through in the shapes of the gestures and the types of and the sound. So the sound world is linking me to a world of practice, and part of that is about metaphors with the more general side of life, and part of that is about um, understanding the skill with which the system has been used, the skill with which the musical language has been has been utilized to express that emotion, to utilize to express that metaphor. So if somebody wants to sound angry, they can do it in lots of different ways. It's quite difficult to sound, well, I don't know, maybe it's not difficult to sound angry on a flute, but it's more there are more examples of people using distorted guitar to create angry music than there are of people using flutes to create angry music. So we've got a kind of given language of that, whereas but we still recognize the types of activity that are making those sounds. So that's not very well explained, but I'm still not entirely sure that I understand the question. That I've
Yeah, understand.
And another possibility we have, sorry, Marco, for interrupting you, my friend. That another possibility we have is that we still have some more questions in the chat, but we are beyond the time. So we're going to try to collect these questions to make it get you. So probably you can read it with more time and develop the answer with more time or more synthetic way.
Yeah, and maybe I could work on a translation that gives me a better understanding of it as well.
Thank you very much for that.
Okay, thank you
for the whole talk. It's been really great to have you here with us. We have had a very, very, very good audience trying to stay active in the chat and everything. So thank you very much, Simon. Before I forget, I want to invite everyone. Antes de que se me olvide, quiero invitar a todo el mundo para que se quede en esta misma transmisión de YouTube, donde va a haber un acto inaugural del Congreso que empieza ya entonces la otra semana.
Thank you very much, Simon. Thank you. See you next week.
Yeah.
At the conference.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I've really enjoyed myself. It's been great, and thank you.
Thank you very much.
See you.
Chao a todos. Muchas gracias.
Carolina, profesora.
Buenas tardes a todos desde aquí, desde Medellín. Mi nombre es Carolina Santamaría, profesora de la Universidad de Antioquia y miembro del comité organizador de este congreso, 14º Congreso de la IASPM Latinoamérica. Bienvenidos.
Saludos a todos, mi nombre es Fernando Gilaraque, soy profesor del Departamento de Música de la Universidad de AFIT. Bienvenidos a todos a este congreso. Bienvenidos.
Bueno, mi nombre es Carlos Caballero, de pronto ya me habían visto por ahí en otra charla. Soy del Instituto Tecnológico Metropolitano y bueno, bienvenidos a este congreso. Vamos a ver cómo nos va. Hasta el momento estamos muy contentos de la participación y bueno, sigamos.
Saludos especiales a todos los compañeros organizadores de sala, a sus instituciones y qué placer tan grande. Mi nombre es Verónica Muriel, soy la jefe de investigación de la Escuela Superior Tecnológica Artes de Borarango. Me complace mucho hacer parte de este equipo de compañeros de organizadores del evento. Aprovecho a todos los asistentes para invitarlos al taller de ruedas y tamboras para que conozcamos nuestros ritmos colombianos. Los esperamos.
Bueno, muy bien. Vamos a darle paso ahora a la presentación por parte de la bienvenida a este evento por parte de Mercedes Lisca, la presidenta de IASPM Latinoamérica, y posteriormente tendremos también un saludo por parte de Simone Lucy Pereira, que es la vicepresidenta actual de la asociación. Así que vamos a rodar sus saludos.
Queridos colegas, amigues, compañeros de trabajo y de debate. Nos pone muy contentos dar apertura a una nueva edición de los Congresos Latinoamericanos de IASPM, que tienen una larga historia con más de 20 años. En este tiempo, la asociación se convirtió en un importante ámbito de comunicación e interrelación regional en temas referidos a las experiencias musicales, en tanto manifestaciones estéticas, sociales y culturales. La temática convocante de este congreso, en torno a las condiciones de trabajo en la música, fue una apuesta político-académica que buscó prestar una atención particular sobre situaciones, tensiones y estrategias de resolución presentes en las condiciones de existencia de la actividad musical. En realidad, esta es una perspectiva que se enmarca en un desarrollo continuo y consolidado de IASPM Latinoamérica como espacio de discusión interdisciplinario de la música, fuertemente comprometido con quienes producen y vitalizan prácticas y representaciones musicales. La situación acuciante de este año en los mundos del arte también abrió nuevos interrogantes que esperamos aparezcan en los debates de los encuentros sincrónicos en cada uno de los simposios temáticos. Es por eso que nos encontramos ante un congreso con un desenvolvimiento bastante distinto al habitual en muchos aspectos. Como todos saben, la organización de este congreso fue compleja e implicó la toma de decisiones impensables y difíciles que intervenían en la vida de muchas personas, con el agregado de tratarse de un congreso de gran magnitud, el más participativo desde sus comienzos. En el camino quedaron los anhelos de muchos colegas que por diversas situaciones no llegaron a compartir sus avances de estudio, y que esperamos que se sientan convocados a asistir a los debates y de ese modo acompañar el desenvolvimiento colectivo de las discusiones temáticas. Este es el inicio de un congreso distinto, resultante de un esfuerzo mayor de todos. Desde la comisión directiva de la asociación, queremos pedir un reconocimiento especial a Carolina Santamaría, colega fundamental de la organización del congreso, y a María Emilia Greco, responsable del proceso de inscripción de cada uno de los miembros de la asociación. Ambas realizaron tareas fundamentales para la concreción organizativa del Congreso, postergando durante mucho tiempo su descanso personal y sus preocupaciones individuales, hecho que nos obliga a recordarlo y a tenerlo presente durante todo el evento. Un agradecimiento especial también a las instituciones convocantes y al equipo completo de la organización del Congreso de Medellín, que sostuvieron la decisión de realizar contramarea el encuentro en un contexto de fuertes cambios en las condiciones personales y laborales debido a la pandemia. La concreción del Congreso nos habla de voluntades persistentes, proclives a reunirnos, de apuestas al despliegue de ideas a partir del fortalecimiento de redes de contacto y de comunicación entre colegas, con experiencias de investigación diversas y en diferentes etapas de formación y consolidación profesionales. Esto también forma parte de una apuesta política de la asociación que tiene que ver con las condiciones en las que se produce conocimiento académico en nuestra región. Si los lazos internacionales deberían ser facilitados por nuestras universidades y otros ámbitos de trabajo, en nuestro caso, la red profesional se gestiona de manera independiente y colaborativa, en la mayoría de los casos. Por todo esto, IASPM Latinoamérica es un poco más que una sumatoria de reflexiones puestas en común. Que este congreso nos encuentre entonces y nos convoque en el desafío de la escucha a la distancia.
Olá, para quem não me conhece, eu sou Simone Lúcia Pereira, eu sou vice-presidente da IASPM América Latina e eu falo de São Paulo, Brasil. Eu queria apenas nessa abertura dar uma saudação a todas e todos e todes e boas-vindas aos participantes desse nosso 14º Congresso da Seção Rama Latino-Americana. Queria agradecer aos organizadores do evento em Medellín, especialmente a Carolina Santa Maria e sua equipe organizadora, que com tanto zelo, afinco e paciência tem feito esse trabalho árduo para que nós possamos estar aqui hoje. Agradeço a todos os sócios, os participantes dos simpósios, aos coordenadores de simpósio, aos conferencistas e a nossa equipe da diretoria, que de diferentes modos reuniu forças, coragem e boa vontade para que tudo seguisse nesses 2 anos de trabalho e que também colaborou de diferentes modos na organização desse evento. Nomeando cada um: Nicolás Masquiran, do Chile, Felipe Trota, do Brasil, Liliana González Moreno, de Cuba, Porto Rico, Maria Emília Greco, da Argentina, e a nossa presidenta incansável, também da Argentina, Mercedes Lisca. Este evento é um desafio para todos nós, tanto na sua concepção, organização e realização, como sempre é um evento dessa magnitude, mas principalmente por esse evento ser virtual à distância. Nesses tempos tão duros de pandemia e isolamento social, vivido de maneiras semelhantes e também disjuntivas nos muitos dos países da América Latina e Caribe, os desafios do coletivo e das maneiras de estar juntos tiveram que ser e estão sendo reinventadas, recriadas, reimaginadas. Inventar novos sentidos de ser em comum e de coletividade em nossa seção, em nossa rama latino-americana. E ainda investigar, refletir e analisar o papel das músicas e das práticas musicais em meio a tudo isso. Mediando valores, mediando práticas, mediando subjetividades, mediando politicidades. Nós não teremos nesse ano os encontros, os abraços, as festas, as conversas nos bares, nas ruas, nos cafés, mas estaremos todos juntos de alguma forma. E esse é o estímulo que eu gostaria de deixar nessa abertura. Que tenhamos um evento rico em discussões, em descobertas, em aprendizagens, trocas, intercâmbios, em elaborações e vislumbres de novos projetos futuros, conjuntos de parcerias, etc. Que tenhamos todos um ótimo encontro. Um abraço.
Bueno, ahora sí, creo que ahora sí estoy al aire, ¿verdad? Bueno, yo creo que ya se dieron cuenta todos que ninguno de nosotros 4 es youtuber. Esto es primera vez que yo lo hago en mi vida. Yo creo que a mis compañeros les pasa exactamente igual. Espero que nuestros compañeros de Latinoamérica, de IASPM, nos entiendan. La verdad que ha sido un esfuerzo bastante grande para lograr tener este importante evento que para todos nosotros, los que estamos en esta área, es absolutamente indispensable. Entonces, Vamos entonces ahorita a presentar, a rodar unos videos de los representantes, rectores o jefes o líderes de cada una de las 4 instituciones. Recordemos que es la Universidad de Antioquia, la Universidad EAFIT, el Instituto Tecnológico Metropolitano y la Escuela Superior Tecnológica de Artes de Arango. Entonces, Daniel, un saludo muy especial a Daniel, que está detrás de bambalinas, backstage, que es el que está ya con 7 manos poniendo videos, poniendo una cosa y la otra. Entonces, vamos a tenerle paciencia y nada, vamos a poner ese videito y nos vemos en unos 5 minuticos.
Un saludo cordial para todos los participantes del 14º Congreso de la Asociación Internacional para el Estudio de la Música Popular en América Latina. Nos cayó la gota fría. Cuando pensábamos en el nombre, nunca creímos que esa gota fría iba a tener que ver con que nos íbamos a reinventar para hacer el Congreso. Teníamos una gran ilusión desde la Universidad de Antioquia y su Facultad de Artes, particularmente del Grupo de Investigación en Músicas Regionales, de hacer posible, de encontrarnos en Medellín todos para pensar, construir, amar profundamente el continente a través de este encuentro, de este evento. Sin embargo, esa reinvención nos llevó a poderlo hacer desde la virtualidad, una virtualidad que también tiene sus valores, que también tiene sus dinámicas, porque nos permite aventurarnos en la construcción escrita, en la acción, en la teoría, para saber qué somos, qué vamos siendo y hacia dónde nos estamos dirigiendo. Esa gota fría está plenamente vigente para construirnos como continente. La Universidad de Antioquia les da la bienvenida, Medellín les da la bienvenida, esta ciudad los sigue esperando. Aquí queremos que vengan, que nos encontremos, que nos podamos abrazar. Bienvenidos al Congreso y bienvenidos a esta ciudad, así sea de manera virtual. Buen día.
Muy buenas tardes, soy Alejandro Valencia, jefe del Departamento de Música de la Universidad EAFIT. En 2018, la profesora Carolina Santamaría se acercó al Departamento de Música de la Universidad de EAFIT con el fin de postular a Medellín como sede del 14º Congreso de la rama latinoamericana de la Asociación Internacional para el Estudio de la Música Popular, IASPM-América Latina. Desde ese momento, la idea fue acogida por el rector Juan Luis Mejía Arango y por el Departamento de Música. 2 años después, es muy gratificante ver cómo no solo la Universidad de Antioquia y EAFIT organizaron el Congreso, sino que se unieron a este proyecto el Instituto Tecnológico Metropolitano y la Escuela Superior Tecnológica de Artes de Arango, lo cual ha sido muy importante en el fortalecimiento académico. Queremos agradecer a la Asociación Internacional para el Estudio de la Música Popular y IASPM-América Latina, en particular a su presidenta Mercedes Lisca, por la confianza brindada a estas 4 instituciones para la organización de este evento. Resaltamos la participación de 240 ponentes y 40 asistentes en este congreso, reunidos en 16 simposios temáticos. Números que demuestran la gran acogida y el fortalecimiento del intercambio académico activo sobre el estudio de la música popular en la región. Finalmente, nos unimos al homenaje a la profesora María Eugenia Londoño, quien desde hace muchos años nos nutre con su conocimiento. Bienvenidos a todos.
Un saludo muy especial desde la institución universitaria ITM en Medellín, para todos los asistentes a este gran Congreso Latinoamericano sobre música popular. Nosotros estamos orgullosamente participando en este evento dentro de nuestro comité organizador, junto con instituciones hermanas tan importantes como la Universidad de Antioquia, EAFIT y la Tecnológica de Arango. A todos los que han participado en esta organización, muchas gracias, porque por ellos estamos hoy aquí, a través de las pantallas, compartiendo con ustedes elementos fundamentales para el trascender de la cultura, de la música popular, de la musicología en Latinoamérica. Sin duda, a partir de esta pandemia nos hemos dado cuenta de lo importante que son las artes para la humanidad. Gracias a ustedes por estar conectados en este 14º Congreso Latinoamericano. Esperamos que las reflexiones académicas sirvan para permear cada una de las carreras de música de nuestras instituciones y que, por supuesto, todos aprendamos mucho de estos grandes elementos. Un saludo para todos y muchos éxitos en el evento.
Un saludo muy especial desde la Escuela Superior Tecnológica de Artes de Arango del municipio de Envigado. Les habla Paola Gómez, la vicerrectora académica de la institución. Estamos muy felices de poder participar en este gran encuentro latinoamericano que va a reflexionar en torno a las economías de los músicos, en torno a la formación y en torno a esas posibilidades que permite la apertura y la colaboración entre los diferentes músicos de Latinoamérica. Muy especialmente quiero invitarlos al taller que van a dirigir dos de nuestros docentes investigadores. El taller Ruedas y Tambores va a generar espacios de interacción entre las músicas tradicionales de Colombia, especialmente del Caribe colombiano, y desde allí tendrán ustedes la posibilidad de interactuar con estos docentes investigadores que tienen una trayectoria importante en ese acercamiento con las comunidades y en esa otra mirada en el que se relaciona la formación, pero también la valoración de todo ese patrimonio musical que tiene nuestro país. Muchas gracias y esperamos que este evento se desarrolle de la mejor manera y sobre todo que sigamos aunando esfuerzos para visibilizar la formación en prácticas artísticas en Colombia. Muy buenas tardes.
Bueno, regresamos. Yo quiero contarles una infidencia ahora, y es que todo esto que está sucediendo, todo lo que ustedes están escuchando, sucedió hace 12 segundos. Es decir, nosotros, todo esto que estamos haciendo suena 12 segundos después, porque YouTube así lo exige. Entonces es complicadísimo ponernos de acuerdo. Estamos pendientes siempre de un chat para que nuestro asistente allá detrás de cámara nos diga, ya, hablen. Entonces a veces no sabemos si estamos hablando o no. Bueno, pero bueno, aquí estamos. La profesora Verónica ya nos había invitado a la rueda de tambores que va a haber, que están abiertas las inscripciones desde el día de hoy. Y yo quiero pedirle entonces al profesor Fernando que empecemos el homenaje a esta gran profesora que yo tuve también personalmente. Fernando.
Sí, señor. Cuando yo era joven, que fue hace mucho tiempo, había una profesora en la universidad que se distinguía de todo el cuerpo profesoral y era la profesora de etnomusicología. Ella es María Eugenia Londoño, que todavía sigue dando clases a todos y sigue siendo nuestra maestra. Y era una clase muy especial porque sus ideas, su alegría en presentar la música de América Latina y de Colombia hacía que le cogiéramos amor por estudiar la música del país. Hace tantos años, 30 años, estudiar la música en Colombia o la música de Colombia era un bicho raro, era el que estudiaba eso, se salía del común, y esa era María Eugenia Londoño. Queremos hacerle hoy un reconocimiento desde el comité organizador acá en Medellín y desde las directivas de IASPM en América Latina, desde Argentina, a María Eugenia, que ha sido nuestra maestra y la guía de muchos para el estudio de la música popular y tradicional en el país. Vamos a ver un pequeño video, pequeño porque resume una gran vida, apenas son 10 minutos, resumiendo la vida de una persona. Entonces los invito a que veamos el video en homenaje y en reconocimiento y en agradecimiento. Tenemos que ser agradecidos y todo esto lo tenemos que hacer en vida, y queremos decirle nuevamente a María Eugenia gracias. Entonces los invito a que veamos este video y nos unamos a este reconocimiento de darle las gracias a María Eugenia.
Hablar de María Eugenia Londoño es dar testimonio de una mujer que ha entregado su vida por la música y por el pueblo, por la nación. Yo creo que la podemos definir en una palabra: fe. Fe en los pueblos, en la gente, fe en la construcción de escuela, fe en las nuevas generaciones y sobre todo fe en que podemos salir adelante. La música en María Eugenia Londoño es testimonio vivo de que podemos ser un pueblo colombiano, un pueblo latinoamericano.
Es que María Eugenia es una mujer de profundas convicciones, de una ética, de una tenacidad y una constancia a prueba de huracanes. Comprometida a morir con la música colombiana, o mejor con los músicos que hacen música colombiana y sus entornos, las comunidades urbanas y rurales, sus contextos. A María Eugenia admiro sobre todo sus convicciones y su capacidad de trabajo.
Cuando llego a Europa, en 1964, encuentro que mi profesor de piano, una tarde en su casa de veraneo, me dice, bueno, yo sé que en Colombia hubo indígenas y esclavos africanos. ¿Cómo son las músicas de estas personas o cómo es la música de estas personas? Y yo no tenía nada que contestarle, eso fue demasiado penoso, doloroso, que yo pudiera hablar, por ejemplo, de Bach o de Chopin o de Beethoven, pero no tenía idea de mis músicas. En ese momento yo hice una decisión y fue, voy a mi país a hacer dos cosas. Lo primero, a conocer eso que no conozco. Y en segundo lugar, a no repetir un proceso pedagógico de una niña aislada tocando un instrumento 8 o 10 horas.
Mi niña,
regresé entonces a Colombia 3 años más tarde a buscar esas músicas, a buscar cómo eran las estructuras, cómo era su ritmo, cómo eran los diseños melódicos, cómo era la armonía, con qué instrumentos esas músicas, qué significaban para la gente, ¿sí? Entonces era la búsqueda de cómo poner esas músicas al servicio de una educación musical acorde con nuestras maneras de ser, de expresarnos, de sentir.
Yo conocí a María Eugenia Londoño cuando tenía 7 años, ya que se mudó cerca de mi casa, vecina, y fue mi primera profesora de piano. Rápidamente me invitó a ser parte de 2 cosas que fueron fundamentales para mí. Lo primero fue los grupos de teología de la liberación que había en aquella época, de los cuales hice parte desde que tenía 11 años y que en realidad fueron mi formación crítica. Y la de María Eugenia creo que en buena medida también. Y me parece que una historia como la de María Eugenia Londoño debe ser incluida en este tipo de historia, de, digamos, antesala de lo decolonial, que no pasa por los libros, sino que pasa por el tipo de acciones de reflexión y de formación de cómo realizar trabajo de grupo. Muy joven también María Eugenia me enseñó y me mostró cómo trabajar, por ejemplo, en la edición de videos con grupos indígenas, cuando ella trabajaba con los NASA y yo de 12 años ya participaba con ella, ella me invitaba. Y no tengo ninguna duda que soy etnomusicóloga por mi amistad con María Eugenia. Es la persona que me ha influenciado más en la vida en términos del pensamiento sobre música y política.
Mi compromiso esencial era venir a conocer mi país en esas prácticas musicales de quienes han hecho la historia de nuestros pueblos. Y de otro lado, de aprovechar esas prácticas musicales en la educación de niños y jóvenes. Y lo interesante de esta búsqueda y de esta construcción de la etnomusicología es poner a dialogar distintos modos de vida, distintas estéticas, distintas maneras de sonar. ¿Por qué? Porque entendemos que si nosotros estudiamos el patrimonio, es decir, la herencia cultural que nos dejaron nuestros antepasados para enriquecer las prácticas de los músicos actuales y futuros, nosotros tenemos que devolverle a las comunidades, a los portadores y a las actuales generaciones y futuras ese material. Y justamente estamos aquí para que nosotros que hacemos historia hoy tratemos de recuperar esa memoria y esos vínculos de identidad hacia un país más noble, hacia un país más fraterno, más equitativo, más justo, más libre y más veraz.
Gracias, Eugenia, por esa semilla que hace más de 40 años plantaste acá en el CRIC, junto al CRIC. Gracias entonces a todos los que están en el empeño, en este trabajo, en este camino, en esta minga de investigación, en los diferentes espacios. Los animo para que mantengan esa paciencia. Seguro que llegará el día en que lleguemos a comprender, y lo que he hecho yo 40 años después germina esta semilla que plantaron, ahora haciendo investigación propia, pues para ir comprendiendo lo que es a profundidad nuestra música. Entonces, abrazo y nos encerramos desde el Cauca.
A mí me gustó mucho la investigación que ellos empezaron a trabajar en la vereda, porque era de una metodología participativa. La parte cosmogónica, la parte de la medicina tradicional, de la naturaleza, de la vida cotidiana, del tipo de alimentos que consumía en la cultura embera. Ella siempre, cuando tenía el contacto con los emberas, ella de alguna manera trataba como de identificarse con ellos. Llegó a compartir hasta las cosas más simples y las cosas complejas con los emberas en cristianía.
María Eugenia nos ha enseñado a trabajar en equipo, mejor, ha sido capaz de formar equipo, de formar escuela, de alimentar un trabajo colegiado, de involucrar a sus estudiantes en sus proyectos. Siendo mujer, ha creado y defendido a capa y espada espacios institucionales para la investigación musical en épocas donde eso no se promovía, no existía, no se valoraba e incluso se despreciaba. Siendo mujer, ha sido la pionera de la etnomusicología en Colombia, tanto en la práctica como en lo formal, pues fue la primera persona que yo sepa con estudios musicales y con estudios formales en etnomusicología. Fue también pionera en la enseñanza de esta disciplina, etnomúsica, como decían en el INIDEF de Caracas, donde estudió.
Pero con la necesidad de constituir un grupo de investigación que solamente logramos constituir en 1991.
Ya luego fui a trabajar a la Escuela Popular de Arte, fundamos el Departamento de Investigación en la EPA. Me atreví a hacer una propuesta con otros 2 compañeros, hicimos un proyecto de investigación con los indígenas en Verachamí, con profesores de filosofía, antropología y psicología de la universidad. ¿Sí? En 1991 se dieron los inicios para constituir el grupo de investigación Valores Musicales Regionales, con el cual trabajo en la Universidad de Antioquia.
El 4º Premio Nacional de Música, modalidad musicología, corresponde al grupo colectivo conformado por Alejandro Tobón Restrepo, María Eugenia Londoño Fernández y el ilustre maestro Jesús Zapata Huiles.
Creo que el aporte más grande de María Eugenia ha sido un aporte de un pensamiento sobre la relación entre políticas de colaboración e investigación, entre formación e investigación, y un pensamiento que incluye profundamente el respeto por la vida. Creo que eso es algo que el país y América Latina deben valorar enormemente. Es un gran aporte y una historia cuyas dimensiones está aún e implicaciones están aún por contar.
María Eugenia, muchas gracias por lo que has hecho y por lo que haces. Una vida de lucha y de trabajo a contracorriente, una abridora de caminos, un referente de la investigación musical y del compromiso con la música colombiana y las comunidades. Un abrazo.
Bueno, regresamos. Es muy emocionante, en serio. Cuando yo creo que Carolina no me deja mentir, hace año y medio que empezamos nosotros a hacer las reuniones y a hacer todo esto y dijimos, bueno, ¿será que no le vamos a hacer un homenaje a alguien? E inmediatamente a mí se me vino la imagen de María Eugenia, que fue mi profesora. A mí particularmente me influyó muchísimo en mi vida profesional porque yo era guitarrista, yo estaba estudiando guitarra clásica en el Conservatorio de la Universidad de Antioquia, estudiando Fernando Sor, Dowland, etc. Y ella me puso a hacer un trabajo de Carlos Vives. Y yo, ¿cómo así? Carlos Vives, sí, tú vas a hacer una canción de Carlos Vives. Y eso fue espectacular, a mí me movió todo, yo quiero que entiendan, y para mí fue muy emocionante, fue muy emocionante. Esas aulas que salieron al principio, en esa clase estaba yo, porque había varios compañeros con los que estudié musicología 1 y 2 con la profesora. Es una maravilla, yo quiero que la invitemos y que esté con nosotros aquí, para desearle aquí en vivo y para decirle todo lo que la queremos y lo que estamos agradecidos con ella. Profesora, bienvenida. Si te puedes unir ya. A ver.
Hola, Maru.
Buenos días, por Dios. Qué sorpresa tan bella y tan colectiva. Básicamente, me conmueve. Es como nosotros de América Latina. Eso me conmueve y me conmueve porque creo que eso es lo que tenemos que luchar, esa autenticidad, esa búsqueda de nosotros. Fíjense que estamos trabajando con la vida, con un legado de siglos, con un legado de personas cuyo espíritu nos siguen moviendo a un derecho de ser libres, de ser autónomos, de construir para todos, no para algunos. Sí, eso es lo que más me conmueve, digamos, agradezco como este espíritu que ustedes han logrado, a cada uno de ustedes. Mucha gente ahí detrás que seguramente yo ni conozco, pero es eso, todos trabajando con algo vivo que es la música, que son las músicas, que son un elemento esencial de comunicación, un elemento vital. Estamos trabajando con la vida, con el ser nuevo de este continente. Agradezco infinitamente a cada uno de ustedes, a la IASPM, a las instituciones que se han ligado al evento. En particular quiero agradecer al Grupo Músicas Regionales, porque créanme que esto es imposible de hacer sin el nosotros, y que cada uno de ustedes sepa que es en nosotros es la posibilidad de algún día tener un país en paz. Agradezco, los amo y espero que ustedes sean capaces de decirle sí a la vida y no a la guerra. Un abrazo
Y simplemente, como decía, te queremos dar las gracias y reconocer tu labor.
Maestra María Eugenia, yo le hablo como artista. Le agradezco mucho porque como artista en música andina colombiana, usted ha afectado la vida de nosotros positivamente, como maestra, como artista, como esa persona que reflexiona siempre lo que nos pasa. Y gracias por estos mensajes que usted nos está dejando el día de hoy.
Carola, usted se salió con las suyas. Carolina, muchas
yo te dije, pero no me hiciste caso, pero muy bien. Felicidades, muchas gracias, María Eugenia.
Sí, verdad. Maestra, qué bueno volverla a ver. Usted fue muy importante para mi vida hace muchísimo tiempo cuando yo hice por allá en el conservatorio. Y queremos hacerle un reconocimiento. Yo le pido a nuestro asistente que está en la parte de atrás que nos presente el reconocimiento que le queremos entregar. Y dice así: la rama latinoamericana de la Asociación Internacional para el Estudio de la Música Popular IASPM-AL, en uso de sus facultades y en el marco del 14º Congreso de la Asociación, realizado de manera virtual desde la ciudad de Medellín, queremos hacer un reconocimiento de la labor realizada por más de 40 años en el estudio de la música tradicional y popular latinoamericana, y en particular de las músicas regionales en Colombia. No menos importante ha sido su liderazgo en la formación de músicos e investigadores que han prolongado su labor desde diferentes ámbitos. Sus publicaciones muestran el amplio y gran trabajo realizado, siendo una ruta de trabajo inspiradora para los jóvenes y para las jóvenes generaciones. Por todo esto, queremos entonces resaltar la labor de la maestra e investigadora María Eugenia Londoño Fernández, firmado en Buenos Aires a los 27 días del mes de noviembre de 2020 por Mercedes Lisca, nuestra presidenta. Un aplauso.
Bravo.
A cada uno de ustedes. Solamente que ese aplauso es para cada uno de ustedes. Sinceramente, solo en nosotros nos conduzca algún día a ese mundo, a ese país, a esa América libre que soñamos. El abrazo es para ustedes.
Gracias, maestra. Gracias. Que esté muy bien.
Gracias, Andrés.
Bueno, entonces ya seguimos nosotros. Sigue entonces, a ver cómo está la profesora Carolina, que es nuestra jefa, a hacer los avisos, como decimos acá en Colombia, parroquiales para la próxima semana.
Muchas gracias, Carlos. Bueno, ustedes seguramente han visto que ya está la página web con los enlaces. Seguramente todavía hay algunos detalles que tenemos que afinar con la página web. Ha sido difícil, pero pues digamos que hemos tenido la colaboración de la gente de AFIT que nos ha ayudado a mantener toda la información y bueno, vamos resolviendo ese problema, los pequeños detalles de la página web, pero espero que estén resueltos ya para que los podamos resolver, podamos ver toda la información y poder estar pendientes entonces de las sesiones virtuales que vienen la próxima semana. También desde AFIT nos van a mandar a todos al correo electrónico todas las instrucciones para que podamos acceder a las aulas de Teams. Recuerden que entonces para poder acceder a estas aulas, nosotros lo vamos a hacerlo a través de sus correos electrónicos que nos pusieron en la inscripción. Por eso es fundamental que ese correo electrónico sea el que ustedes consulten para encontrar la información y a través de ese mismo correo poder conectarse con todo lo que, pues para poder entrar a las aulas virtuales. Quiero recordarles que también está la programación en PDF dentro de la página web. También está el libro de resúmenes que pues, ustedes pueden consultar. La idea es que para poder acceder a estas sesiones y poder hacer unas discusiones interesantes, lo mejor sería que todos pudiéramos ver las ponencias con anticipación. Así que los invito a que consulten la página web, a que, digamos, pueda haber también intercambios antes de las sesiones. Los coordinadores van a estar muy atentos a que podamos comenzar estas discusiones y así hacer unos encuentros más fructíferos. Por último, quiero también avisarles que el viernes, como ya nos dijo la profesora Ruth Verónica, vamos a tener la rueda de tambores. Ustedes ya pueden entrar a la página web, se pueden inscribir, ahí, digamos, se puede participar como oyente o se puede también participar como miembro activo. Ahí está toda la información. Ustedes están muy invitados a participar de esas actividades. Y también el viernes, antes de la rueda, vamos a tener la asamblea. En la asamblea, pues es en el momento en el cual se hacen diferentes actividades que tienen que ver con la organización de la asociación. Y al final vamos a tener un brindis virtual. Así que recuerden ese día tener un vino, una cerveza, un cafecito, lo que ustedes quieran, porque nos vamos a encontrar. La idea es, además de discutir todas estas cosas que hay que discutir en una asociación, también sea la posibilidad de encontrarnos, o si sea de manera virtual, y abrazarnos virtualmente, pero brindar con un café, con un chocolate, vino, mate, lo que ustedes quieran. Así que, bueno, bienvenidos nuevamente a este congreso y estamos a la orden para lo que necesiten.
Bueno, un abrazo para todos. Nos despedimos, nos vamos despidiendo. Muchas gracias. De nuevo, disculpen los errores que hayan pasado. Estamos tratando de sacarlo todo adelante. Yo tengo que agradecer a las 4 instituciones, a estos 4 compañeros que están aquí en el panel porque ha sido difícil. Nuestra compañera Ruth Verónica estuvo muy enferma. Hace muy poco estuvo bien enferma, no les voy a decir de qué, pero me imagino que ya todos se imaginan de qué es muy duro, ustedes saben, entonces quiero que lo entiendan. Carolina, que es la guía, la que nos está llevando siempre, mandando los correos, Fernando con toda su plataforma de la Universidad EAFIT, que es donde vamos a estar la próxima semana, y bueno, y en la parte nuestra del ITM, que es donde yo estoy, agradecer al área de comunicaciones, a Daniel Santiago Palacios, alias El Panda, que es el que nos ha estado ayudando, él es el que pone las figuras, el que pone las imágenes, los videos, todo. Muy agradecidos con todos y muchas gracias.
Saludos a todos.
Saludos y éxitos en las jornadas. Saludos.